January 17th, 1945. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 547 hours. The snow fell in silence, thick and undisturbed, covering the wreckage of war like a burial shroud. In the pre-dawn darkness, German Generalmajor Heinrich von Ludwitz stood at the frosted window of a commandeered farmhouse, his breath fogging the glass as he peered toward the American lines 3 kilometers distant. The temperature had dropped to -15 Celsius. His fingers, wrapped around a tin cup of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, had gone numb despite the gloves. Outside, the skeletal remains of 2 American Sherman tanks sat motionless in the snow-covered field, knocked out by his eye. Panther crews 36 hours earlier. Black scorch marks scored their hulls. One turret hung at an unnatural angle, frozen in its death throes. He had counted them himself through binoculars at twilight. 2 kills, confirmed, final. Yet something gnawed at the edge of his military consciousness, something his 23 years of Wehrmacht service couldn't quite articulate. The Americans had stopped firing at 2,100 hours the previous night. Complete radio silence. No counter-battery fire. No probing attacks. Nothing. Just the wind howling through shattered pines and the distant rumble of what his intelligence officer insisted were supply trucks retreating westward. Von Ludwitz wanted to believe it. His men needed to believe it. They had been fighting since December 16th without adequate resupply, earning furniture for warmth, stretching quarter rations into half rations into memories of rations. The great gamble operation whacked am Rhein, the Führer's master stroke to split the Allied armies and recapture. Antwerp had stalled in these frozen forests like a once mighty engine seizing in the cold. But those sounds, those mechanical sounds that carried on the winter wind, they didn't sound like retreat. This was the crucible moment neither von Ludwitz nor any officer of the Wehrmacht High Command had truly prepared for. Despite all the intelligence briefs, despite all the captured American equipment, they had examined with equal parts derision and confusion. They had studied American doctrine. They had interrogated American prisoners. They had read about American industrial capacity in sanitized reports. They used phrases like substantial manufacturing output and mechanized logistics superiority. But words on paper, even accurate words, could not capture the civilizational chasm that was about to reveal itself in the coming dawn. Fundamental difference between an army that fought for territory and an army that fought with abundance. Between soldiers who had been told to hold until death and soldiers who had been given permission to waste. The German military tradition, forged in the crucible of limited resources and Prussian efficiency, had trained generations of officers to worship the gods of tactical brilliance and operational economy. Every shell mattered. Every tank was precious. Every gallon of fuel was rationed like liquid gold because the refineries in Plötzky were being bombed into rubble and the synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr were running at 30% capacity. German mechanics were magicians by necessity, keeping Panther and Tiger tanks operational with scavenged parts, welding broken transmission gears back together, cannibalizing 3 disabled tanks to make 1 battle-worthy. A destroyed German tank remained destroyed for weeks, sometimes months, waiting for parts that would never arrive, for factory support that no longer existed, for a logistical system that had collapsed under the weight of Allied strategic bombing. When von Ludwitz's tank commanders knocked out American Shermans, they did so with grim satisfaction, believing they had struck a meaningful blow against enemy combat power. In the calculus of attrition warfare, the only calculus they knew each, destroyed tank represented weeks or months before replacement. This was how war worked. This was how it had always worked. From the Western Front of 1918 to the steppes of Russia to the deserts of North Africa, the mathematics of destruction remained constant. kill enemy equipment faster than they can replace it, and eventually, they must yield. No one had prepared them for an enemy who could simply choose not to play by those rules. At 0612 hours, as the first gray light began to leak into the eastern sky, Obergefreiter Klaus Schmidt, a forward observer positioned in a concealed foxhole 200 meters from the American lines, whispered urgently into his field telephone. His voice carried the kind of confusion that borders on panic. "Herr Generalmajor, you need to see this." I don't understand what I'm seeing." Von Luttwitz grabbed his binoculars and moved to the observation post on the farmhouse's second floor, his boots echoing on wooden stairs. Through the magnified lenses, the scene that resolved itself in the gathering dawn light violated every principle of armored warfare he had ever learned. The two Sherman tanks, same two Shermans his crews had definitively destroyed 36 hours prior, were moving, not being towed, not being dragged by recovery vehicles to some distant repair depot, moving under their own power, engines running, tracks churning through the snow, turrets traversing with the smooth mechanical precision of fully operational combat vehicles. And surrounding them, spilling across the field like a plague of steel locusts, were dozens more Shermans. Fresh Shermans. Gleaming Shermans. Shermans that hadn't been there when darkness fell. "Unglitch," von Luttwitz whispered. "Impossible." But the evidence of his eyes would not be denied. The American tanks advanced in a loose formation, maintaining interval, supporting one another with textbook coordination. And then, as the lead Sherman passed the position where it had burned just hours before, where von Luttwitz himself had seen, the smoke rising from its engine deck, he heard it, carried on the cold morning air, distorted by distance and disbelief, came the sound of laughter. American voices, hollering and whooping like cowboys at a rodeo. One tank crew had tied what appeared to be a captured Nazi banner to their radio antenna, letting it stream behind them like a mocking pennant. They were laughing as they drove past the German positions and tanks that should have been corpses. To understand the psychological earthquake that morning represented, one must travel backward 4 years, to the moment when German military planners first began receiving detailed intelligence about American industrial mobilization. In 1941, as Operation Barbarossa ground toward Moscow, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht received reports that seemed too absurd to credit. President Roosevelt had announced a goal of producing 60,000 aircraft in 2 years. 60,000. The entire Luftwaffe possessed approximately 4,000 combat aircraft at the start of the Russian campaign. Staff officers in Berlin checked and rechecked the translation, certain there had been an error in decimal placement. There had been no error. By the end of 1943, American factories had produced not 60,000 aircraft, but over 85,000. By the end of 1944, that number exceeded 96,000. And these were not primitive biplanes or training craft. These were B-17 Flying Fortresses, P-51 Mustangs, C-47 transport planes built to standards of quality and abundance that seemed to mock the very concept of wartime scarcity. But aircraft were abstract things, distant threats that fell from the sky. Tanks were different. Tanks were intimate. Tanks you could see, could touch, could kill. And the American tank, the M4 Sherman, with its boxy profile and inadequate armor, had become the subject of dark German humor. German tank crews called them Ronsens, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit on fire so easily. A single Tiger tank at Villers-Bocage had destroyed 28 Allied tanks in 15 minutes. The German 88mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1.5 miles, while the Sherman's 75mm gun could barely scratch a Tiger's hide at 300 meters. So the Germans killed Shermans. Thousands of them. They shot them, burned them, watched them explode with satisfying regularity. And they learned to feel nothing but contempt for American tank crews who rode into battle in what German veterans called death traps and rolling coffins. What they failed to understand, what the mathematics of industrial war could not make them understand until that frozen morning in January was that American strategic doctrine didn't require the Sherman to be invincible. It only required the Sherman to be replaceable, faster than the Germans could destroy them, faster than German mechanics could repair their own casualties, faster than the concept of destroyed had any operational meaning. The United States produced 49,234 Sherman tanks during World War II. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panther tanks and 1,347 Tiger tanks, their best armored fighting vehicles. But even these numbers, staggering in their disparity, don't capture the full civilizational gap, because production was only the beginning of the story. Getting those tanks to the battlefield, keeping them running, repairing them when damaged, maintaining the supply chains that fed them fuel and ammunition and spare parts. This was where American logistical superiority transformed from impressive to incomprehensible behind those laughing American tank crews. Advancing through the Ardennes snow stood an invisible army that dwarfed the combat forces, the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department. By 1945, American ordnance units had perfected a system of tank repair and maintenance that operated at speeds the German General Staff literally could not believe when confronted with field reports. Mobile ordnance workshops traveled within kilometers of the front lines, equipped with cutting torches, welding equipment, hydraulic lifts, and warehouses of spare parts. Tank retrievers specialized. Recovery vehicles with powerful winches could extract damaged tanks from under enemy, fire and have them back to repair depots within hours. An American tank disabled by mechanical failure or moderate battle damage could be assessed, diagnosed, and triaged within 30 minutes of reaching an ordnance collection point. If the damage was deemed repairable in American ordnance, officers defined repairable far more optimistically than their German counterparts. The tank entered an assembly line, process that would have been familiar to any Detroit factory worker. One team pulled the engine. Another team replaced the transmission. A third team installed a new turret traverse mechanism. Parts weren't fabricated or improvised. They were simply grabbed from organized stockpiles of components, each one precisely manufactured to interchangeable specifications. A Sherman that threw a track on Tuesday morning could be driving back to the front line on Wednesday afternoon. But even this systematic efficiency pales before the most audacious element of American tank maintenance doctrine, the battlefield exchange program. When a Sherman took damage too severe for field repair, a penetrated hull, a catastrophic engine fire, a destroyed turret, American doctrine didn't require crews to wait for their specific tank to be repaired. They simply got a different tank. Ordnance units maintained pools of ready-to-issue Shermans at forward depots. A tank crew that lost their vehicle in combat could walk to the nearest ordnance collection point, report their loss, and be issued a replacement Sherman, fully fueled, fully armed, fully operational, often within the same day. The tank itself was disposable. The crew was valuable. This inversion of traditional military logic represented something profound and disturbing to German military minds. A military that could afford to waste. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a veteran Panzer officer who commanded a company of Panther tanks in the Ardennes, later recorded his bewilderment in a diary entry dated January 18, 1945. "We destroyed 6 American tanks yesterday. Confirmed kills, all of them burning. This morning, we counted 14 American tanks in the same sector. I no longer know how to calculate enemy strength. Do we count the tanks we destroy? Or only the tanks we see? The Americans seem to treat their Shermans like we treat ammunition expendable supplies that exist only to be expended. How does one fight an enemy who views the loss of a 30-ton tank as an acceptable operational expense? Weber's question struck at the existential core of Germany's predicament. The Wehrmacht had designed its doctrine around quality overcoming quantity, around tactical brilliance compensating for material disadvantage, around the individual superiority of German soldiers and equipment. These were not mere propaganda lies. In many measurable ways, German tanks were superior, German tactical training was more thorough, German operational art more sophisticated. A Tiger tank could destroy 5 Shermans before being knocked out itself. German tank crews often did demonstrate better gunnery and tactical sense than their American counterparts. But when the Americans could replace those 5 Shermans overnight and come back with 10 more, what did superiority mean? When American mechanics could repair battle damage in hours that would take German workshops weeks, what did winning a tank battle actually accomplish? The Germans were playing chess while the Americans were playing a game where the rules allowed them to return captured pieces to the board. As von Luttwitz watched that impossible column of Shermans roll past his positions in the dawn light, he experienced what can only be described as ideological collapse. The Nazi philosophy that had sustained his career, that had justified every hardship and sacrifice, rested on a foundation of racial and cultural superiority. Germans were supposed to be more disciplined, more efficient, more capable than the decadent, mongrelized Americans. The Führer had said so. The propaganda ministry had said so. The evidence of the Eastern Front, where tactical German formations had destroyed entire Soviet armies, seemed to confirm it, but these Americans driving past, laughing in their magically resurrected tanks, told a different story. They told a story about a civilization so staggeringly wealthy that it could treat armored vehicles as consumables, so organizationally competent that it could perform in 18 hours what German logistics deemed impossible in 18 days, so materially abundant that battlefield losses became mere accounting inconveniences. This abundance, American abundance, carried with it an almost mythological quality to German soldiers experiencing it firsthand. Captured American K-Rations, distributed to Wehrmacht units as supplemental food, became objects of wonder and resentment. Each cardboard box contained not just calories, but variety: canned meat, biscuits, chocolate bars, cigarettes, chewing gum, instant coffee, sugar, toilet paper, water purification tablets. German soldiers, subsisting on black bread and thin soup, would open these boxes with the reverence of archaeologists discovering ancient treasure. The chocolate alone represented more sugar than many German civilians had seen in months. Obergefreiter Johann Steiner, captured by American forces in late January 1945, described his first meal as a prisoner of war in terms that sound almost religious. They gave us white bread. Actual white bread, soft and fresh, not the sawdust mixture we'd been eating for 2 years. With butter, real butter, and as much as we wanted. I thought perhaps this was a special meal, a propaganda exercise to show us American generosity. But the next day, the same. And the next day, one of the guards told me through an interpreter that this was normal rations, that American soldiers ate like this every day. I didn't believe him. I couldn't believe him. How could an army feed its soldiers like kings and still have enough to fight a war? The symbolic power of American food cannot be overstated when understanding the psychological impact on German forces. Food, perhaps more than any other element of material culture, represented the fundamental difference between the two systems. German soldiers were constantly hungry, not starving, but existing in a state of perpetual caloric deficit that ground away at morale and physical capability. Rations had been cut and cut again. Horses were being eaten. Troops joked grimly that the K in K-Rations must stand for Kartoffeln, potatoes, since that's all they ever seemed to receive. Meanwhile, American supply dumps captured during the initial German offensive in December revealed warehouses, stacked floor to ceiling with food, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, medical supplies, winter clothing, and mysterious luxuries like Coca-Cola and bottled beer. German soldiers who penetrated deepest into American supply lines emerged with stories that sounded like fairy tales to their starving comrades. Entire trucks loaded with nothing but cigarettes, boxes of oranges from California, containers of fresh eggs still cold from refrigeration. One German officer, surveying a captured American supply depot, made an observation that would later appear in U.S. Army intelligence reports. This depot alone contains more material wealth than my entire division has seen in 6 months. And this is just one depot. How many more do they have? How deep do their reserves go? We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an entire continent's industrial output, and the continent seems to have no bottom. He was correct. The United States in 1945 represented roughly 40% of global industrial production. The American economy had grown during the war, not contracted. American civilian consumption of many goods had actually increased while fighting a two-front war across 2 oceans. This wasn't just military superiority, this was a different kind of civilization. One that had solved problems of production and distribution in ways that made traditional European military logic obsolete. The tank repair system was merely one manifestation of this broader reality. American ordnance units didn't repair tanks faster because American mechanics were more skilled. German mechanics were arguably better trained in improvisation and field expedient solutions. Americans repaired faster because they had systemized the process, had removed the need for improvisation through overwhelming material preparation. Why weld a broken gear when you could simply bolt in a new one from stock? Why fabricate a custom part when 50 identical replacements sat in a nearby warehouse? This approach required accepting waste as a feature, not a bug. It required stockpiling parts that might never be used, maintaining supply chains that transported redundant equipment, building entire factories dedicated to producing replacement components. It was inefficient by traditional metrics, but it was devastatingly effective by the only metric that mattered. Operational tempo. German forces in the Ardennes offensive discovered this temporal advantage too late. The initial German assault had achieved tactical surprise, punching deep into American lines surrounding the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, threatening to split Allied armies. For 72 hours, it seemed that German tactical excellence might indeed overcome material disadvantage. American units fell back. Equipment was abandoned. Prisoners were taken, and then the American machine engaged. Not just the combat forces, but the entire logistical apparatus behind them. Within a week, General Patton's Third Army had disengaged from operations in the Saar, pivoted 90 degrees north, and counterattacked into the German flank, a maneuver of such organizational complexity that German staff officers initially dismissed intelligence reports as disinformation. No army could move that many divisions that quickly. The roads would be choked. The supply lines would collapse. It was operationally impossible. Except the Americans did it anyway, because their logistics weren't built around minimums and careful husbanding of scarce resources. They were built around maximums and overwhelming excess. Truck convoys ran day and night. Supply dumps were positioned forward aggressively, accepting the risk of capture because more supplies could always be brought forward. Tanks that broke down were abandoned by the roadside with the understanding that recovery teams would collect them later. Speed of advance mattered more than preservation of individual vehicles. By mid-January, the German offensive had stalled, then reversed, then collapsed into retreat. And throughout that retreat, German forces experienced the surreal phenomenon von Luttwitz had witnessed: American tanks that should have been destroyed, returning to combat with impossible speed. Fresh American units appearing in sectors that should have been depleted. Supply convoys rolling forward over roads that German demolitions had supposedly made impassable. The laughter that haunted von Luttwitz's memory, those American voices whooping as they drove past in resurrected Shermans carried within it a message more devastating than any artillery barrage. We can afford to lose. Can you? Because that was the unspoken reality underlying every engagement. Every tank the Germans destroyed took them marginally closer to operational collapse. Every tank the Americans lost was an accounting entry, a widget in a production report, a statistic that would be replaced before the paperwork was processed. German forces were fighting World War I with better equipment, trying to achieve decisive tactical victories that would force operational paralysis on their enemy. American forces were fighting a war of industrial attrition where decisive tactical victories didn't exist, where the enemy's greatest strength was their institutional willingness to absorb losses that would break any traditional military. This abundance doctrine extended beyond mere equipment. American combat units maintained casualty replacement systems that German officers found almost obscene. A German division that took 50% casualties was destroyed as a fighting force, requiring months of reconstitution, retraining, rebuilding. An American division that took 50% casualties would receive replacement soldiers within days, not green recruits, but trained men pulled from a vast replacement pipeline that stretched back to training camps in Texas and Louisiana. The division would be back to full strength and operational capability within 2 weeks. Were these replacement soldiers as experienced as the casualties they replaced? No. Were they as effective as veterans with 6 months of combat experience? No. But they were there, and they were armed, and they were supported by the same overwhelming material superiority that turned every engagement into a grinding mathematical equation that the Germans could not win. Hans Mahler, a company commander in the 12th SS Panzer Division, recorded a conversation with an American prisoner that captures this dawning understanding. I asked the American captain how many tanks his battalion had lost since Normandy. He told me 63. I asked how many replacement tanks his battalion had received. He looked at me as though I had asked something foolish and said they maintained full strength at all times, that replacement tanks arrived whenever needed. I asked where these tanks came from. He said from ordnance depots. I asked where the depots received them from. He said from ports. I asked where the ports received them from. He said from factories in America. He said this as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though armies always had unlimited equipment. Perhaps American armies do. Perhaps American armies did. By 1945, the United States had created a military logistics system that functioned more like a modern corporation supply chain than a traditional military organization. Ordnance depots operated with inventory management systems borrowed from civilian retail. Supply officers used punch card machines to track equipment flows. Maintenance schedules followed industrial efficiency models developed in automotive manufacturing. The U.S. military had industrialized war in ways that made traditional military virtues courage, tactical brilliance, individual heroism not irrelevant, but insufficient. On the morning of January 17th, when those impossible Shermans rolled past von Luttwitz's positions, they carried with them the accumulated weight of an entire civilization's industrial capacity. Each tank represented not just 30 tons of steel and machinery, but thousands of hours of factory labor, months of supply chain coordination, decades of industrial development, centuries of economic philosophy that prioritized productive efficiency over martial tradition. The Germans had built an army designed to win battles. The Americans had built a system designed to win wars. And in that frozen Belgian dawn, the difference between those two concepts became existentially clear. By February 1945, the German military situation in the West had deteriorated from critical to catastrophic. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major gamble, had consumed the Wehrmacht's strategic reserves for no meaningful gain. Divisions that might have defended the Rhine were scattered as wreckage across Belgian forests. Tank units that had spent irreplaceable fuel pushing west now sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. And everywhere, German soldiers told stories about American tank columns that grew larger each day, about equipment that reappeared after being destroyed, about an enemy who seemed to possess magical powers of regeneration. These weren't just anecdotes. After-action reports from German units in January and February 1945 repeatedly note confusion about American tank strengths, with intelligence officers unable to reconcile counts of destroyed American armor with observed numbers of operational tanks. In some sectors, German forces reported destroying more American tanks than intelligence estimates suggested were present in the LD sector, and yet American armored attacks continued with undiminished strength. The explanation was the system von Luttwitz had witnessed. The American ordnance network that moved damaged tanks to repair within hours, that replaced destroyed tanks within days, that maintained forward stockpiles of ready-to-issue equipment. But to German officers raised in a military tradition that valued equipment preservation and careful maintenance of scarce resources, this system seemed to violate natural law. It suggested an abundance so extreme it bordered on the supernatural. And perhaps it was supernatural, in a sense not divine intervention, but the manifestation of a different kind of social organization. American democracy, whatever its flaws and contradictions, had produced an economic system that generated wealth at scales previous civilizations couldn't imagine. That wealth translated into productive capacity, which translated into military power, which translated into those laughing American tank crews driving past German positions and vehicles that should have been corpses. The symbolic resonance of American abundance haunted German military thinking. Throughout the war's final months, officers who had built careers believing in Germanic superiority found themselves confronting evidence that material wealth might matter more than racial mythology. Soldiers who had been promised victory through willpower and discipline discovered that will and discipline couldn't conjure replacement parts or additional fuel. The entire ideological apparatus that justified the Nazi regime, the claims of Aryan excellence, the promises of Lebensraum in the East, the vision of a 1,000-year Reich crumbled when confronted with the mundane reality of American logistics. That Sherman tank, derided by German tank crews as inferior in armor and firepower, became an involuntary symbol of democratic capitalism's triumph over fascist militarism. Not because the Sherman was a better tank in most technical specifications. It wasn't. But because the Sherman was replaceable, was repairable, was available in quantities that made technical inferiority operationally irrelevant. The Germans could build better tanks, but couldn't build enough of them, couldn't maintain enough of them, couldn't support them with enough fuel and ammunition and spare parts. American factories could stamp out Shermans faster than German guns could destroy them, and American ordnance units could repair Shermans faster than German intelligence officers could update their casualty estimates. That Generalmajor von Luttwitz survived the war and spent several years in British custody before returning to Germany. In interviews conducted in the 1950s, he repeatedly returned to that January morning, to the sight of those impossible tanks rolling through the snow. "I knew in that moment," he said in one interview, "that we had already lost. Not because of that specific engagement, but because of what it represented. We were fighting a nation that could afford to waste tanks. We were a nation that couldn't afford to waste anything. The mathematics were inevitable. Those mathematics told a story about the relationship between economic systems and military outcomes, between abundance and scarcity, between democracies that produced wealth and tyrannies that consumed it. The Sherman tanks rolling past German positions were weapons, yes. But they were also arguments about which civilization could mobilize resources more effectively, which social system could organize human labor more efficiently, which economy could sustain the grinding arithmetic of industrial war. The Americans, who laughed as they drove past, understood this intuitively, even if they couldn't articulate it in grand strategic terms. They laughed because they knew their tank could be replaced, because they knew another would be waiting if this one got hit, because they had internalized the abundance that terrified their enemies. They laughed because they fought for a system that valued their lives more than it valued equipment, that would rather lose a tank than a crew, that possessed such overwhelming material superiority it could afford to prioritize human survival over operational efficiency. This was the fundamental difference, not in courage, not in tactical skill, not in willingness to sacrifice, but in what each side could afford to sacrifice. German soldiers fought, knowing every loss was irreplaceable, that every casualty brought their nation closer to collapse, that their deaths and the deaths of their comrades would ultimately mean nothing because the mathematics made defeat inevitable. American soldiers fought knowing the system behind them was inexhaustible, that losses would be replaced, that the nation's productive capacity could outlast any enemy's will to resist that by April 1945. As American and Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from opposite directions, the German military had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Units surrendered en masse. Soldiers deserted by the thousands. Officers who had spent careers preaching discipline and obedience abandoned their posts and fled west, hoping to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. The myths that had sustained the Wehrmacht, myths of tactical superiority, of German martial excellence, of will triumphing over material disadvantage, had been ground into dust by the weight of want. Allied industrial production, those Sherman tanks, rolling through German positions in January 1945, had been harbingers of this collapse. Each one represented not just a weapon, but a promise that the Allied system could outlast, outproduce, and overwhelm any enemy through sheer material abundance. A promise proved true in the decades after the war. Military historians would analyze the Ardennes offensive and debate tactical decisions, strategic objectives, operational mistakes. But the fundamental truth remained stark and undeniable. Germany had lost the war the moment American industrial mobilization began. Everything afterward, all the battles, all the sacrifices, all the tactical victories was epilogue, the laughter of those American tank crews, echoing across the frozen Belgian morning, was the sound of one civilization recognizing its absolute material superiority over another. It was the sound of democracy celebrating not through propaganda or ideology, but through the simplest possible demonstration. We can fix our tanks faster than you can destroy them. We can replace our losses faster than you can inflict them. We can afford to waste, and you cannot. That waste, that glorious, terrible, overwhelming abundance, was the weapon that won the war. Not valor, not justice, not moral superiority, but the grinding mathematical certainty that America's factories could outproduce Germany's will to fight, that American logistics could maintain operational tempo faster than German forces could respond, that American mechanics could repair 30-ton tanks overnight, while German tanks sat disabled for want of a single replacement part. Generalmajor Heinrich von Luttwitz watched those tanks disappear into the dawn, their laughter fading into the rumble of engines and the crunch of tracks on snow. He set down his binoculars. He finished his acorn coffee. And in the silence that followed, he understood with perfect clarity that the war was already over. Everything remaining was simply the universe working through the implications of facts already established. The impossible had become routine. The miraculous had become standard operating procedure. And somewhere far to the west, beyond the horizon, in ports and factories and ordnance depots scattered across a continent, more Shermans were being built, more supplies were being loaded, more replacement parts were being cataloged and shipped and stored, ready to feed the machine that had no intention of stopping until every square meter of Nazi Germany had been crushed beneath the treads of tanks that refused to stay dead. This was abundance as strategy. This was waste as doctrine. This was the promise of democratic capitalism made manifest in the most terrible way possible, through the power to destroy faster than the enemy could rebuild, to repair faster than the enemy could damage, to replace faster than the enemy could comprehend. The Shermans rolled on into history, laughing,